But nevertheless, I hope it is no crime to laugh at all things, for I wish to know what, after all, are all things but a show. They accuse me, the present writer of the present poem, of I know not what, a tendency to underrate and scoff at human power and virtue and all that. And this, they say, in language rather rough. Good God! I wonder what they would be at. I say no more than hath been said in Dante's verse, and by Solomon, and by Cervantes, by Swift, by Machiavel, by Rochefoucauld, by Fenelon, by Luther, and by Plato, by Tillotson and Wesley and Rousseau, who knew this life was not worth a potato. 'Tis not their fault, nor mine, if this be so. For my part, I pretend not to be Cato, nor even Diogenes. We live and die, but which is best, you know no more than I.
Lovely Regency accent.
Thank you. I'm naturally Byronic.
Hello and welcome. This is the 9th episode of our close reading series on satire for the London Review of Books. I'm Claire Bucknell, and that pathetic impersonation of Byron was by Colin Burrow, who is with me today as we tackle Byron's satirical epic poem, Don Juan. And that was, I believe, Colin, a passage from its 7th canto.
Yep, and it is Don Juan, not Don Juan.
Yes, I didn't do Spanish at school, but I promise that isn't a mistake. One of the first jokes you encounter in the poem is Byron's use of Juan as a rhyme word. So he rhymes it with true one and new one and through on and ruin and even brewing.
Doesn't do chewing though, does he?
I don't think he does do
I
chewing.
ought to, yeah.
He should. Yeah, so there's a lot of messing around with languages throughout French and Latin and Russian, Italian, as well as Spanish.
Capiche. But if we go back to those stanzas I just read, I mean, obviously they're not entirely in earnest because Byron seldom ever is, but I'm not a philosopher, but I don't think it's usual in philosophical circles to rhyme Cato and Plato with potato, is it?
Yeah, confirmed. Yeah.
Yeah. But that aside, I'm wondering if perhaps Byron is giving us a sort of satirical mission statement for Don Juan as a whole in that passage. I mean, setting out his stall as a satirist of human vanity in the tradition of Cervantes and Swift and the Stoics. And so our life on earth is not worth a potato. Human power and virtue are things you scoff at. Everything's a show. We live, we die. No one knows how or why, and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing is worth taking seriously for long. I hope it is no crime to laugh at all things.
But Claire, I mean, it does seem an awfully long poem just to be claiming that human life is a worthless sham. Yeah. 17 cantos, each of which, apart from the last unfinished one, has over 100 stanzas. So 16,000 odd lines of poetry in total. So to put that in context, Paradise Lost, that great poem, has 10,000 or so lines, and that gives us the fall of man, all of human history. Don Juan, by contrast, a little bit wordy and inconsequential.
And that's the end of the podcast. No,
I will be converted by the end of the podcast. But
you will, because there is, Colin, a good deal more to Don Juan than laughing at all things. And in fact, I think the issue is that trying to say what Don Juan is about or what it thinks about the world is exceptionally difficult. And that's because what it's about at any given moment isn't the same as what it was about a few stanzas before. The poem has the attention span of a gnat or a Gen Zer. Bit of commentary there. Mm-hmm. So what we just heard might sound like a mission statement, but I think it's more like a costume or a posture, something Byron tries on momentarily and then discards in favour of something else.
So the stanzas I quoted take a basically sceptical view of the world and the human condition, and I suppose, I mean, Byron's scepticism owes quite a lot to that scuzzy hero of an earlier episode in this series, the Earl of Rochester, doesn't it? I mean, he's got that same world-weary, bilious sense that nothing is quite worthwhile. But that isn't the whole story of Byron, is it? I mean, Byron can be found elsewhere adopting a radical political perspective or a sort of romantic, passionate attitude.
Yeah. So Don Juan constantly takes up positions that it then goes on to question or reject. It's like a giant poetic contradiction, which is one of Byron's favourite words in the poem. I leave the thing a problem like all things, and he says right at the end of the last canto.
Yeah, and just to be clear, can we identify Byron with the narrator of the poem? I mean, my sense is they're not always exactly the same thing, are they?
Yeah, well, there are clues in Canto 1, as well as a prose preface to the poem that Byron didn't end up publishing, we know that he began with the idea of narrating the poem in character as a Spanish gentleman, one who, conveniently had a great command of English.
Right.
But from Canto 2 onwards, he sort of drops the act and the narrative voice becomes more and more closely aligned with his own.
Okay, and the reference points of the narrator become increasingly autobiographical as well, don't they? Although Byron, of course, often tells us off for assuming that he has real people and real events in mind.
Yeah, as satirists tend to do.
Yeah.
But, so I think for our purposes today, we're safe to conflate Byron the poet, Byron the man, with Byron the Don Juan narrator.
Okay, we'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
So in our last podcast, but one on Sterne's Tristram Shandy, we were dealing with the sort of weird case of a satire that doesn't really have a target. Mm-hmm. But I suppose in Don Juan we got something a bit different again, because it looks to me almost as though Byron can't quite make up his mind what it is he's satirising, or indeed whether he wants to be satirical exactly in the first place.
I think so. And Don Juan is a different beast to other long verse satires like Pope's Dunciad because it puts its uncertainty and lack of conviction on show. It's a satire about how hard it is to make moral and satiric judgments and about how few amongst us have the right to do so. And I think that's why it's so exciting to talk about in a way that some of the more traditional satires that Byron wrote, such as his early poem English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, more on that shortly, sort of aren't.
Okay. But could we take a sort of tiny step backwards? Because I know you said that Don Juan isn't really about any one particular thing, but our regular listeners will be expecting to hear you summarise its plot with excessive detail and massive spoilers in a very short space of time. So it's about a Spanish gentleman called Juan, right? Or Juan, right?
Hi to our regular listeners.
Yeah.
Don Juan, is a long narrative poem whose hero, and you have to imagine giant floating inverted commas above that word, is a young man from Seville called Juan, whose father's name is Don Jose, or maybe Don Jose, as Byron might have said, and whose mother's name is Donna Inez.
And where exactly in Seville do Juan and his parents live, Claire?
Of course, you're making me do this. Don Juan's parents live beside the river, a noble stream, and called the Guadalquivir.
Guadalquivir to you, I think, probably, but it's very good to clarify.
Yeah. And we know from various historical pointers in the poem that the action takes place roughly 30 years before Byron began writing it, during the turbulent, revolutionary early 1790s.
Okay, and that is important because it locates Don Juan, the poem and the man, I suppose, in a moment of historical possibility where anything could happen. But before the forces of reaction that Byron loathes had brought the shutters down all over Europe. So it's before tyrants in an age of revolution.
Yeah, exactly. So the imaginary Don Juan, born in roughly the early 1770s, is, let's say, 15 years older than the real Lord Byron, born in 1788. But that relatively small gap is key in terms of the very different historical moments in which they reached adulthood.
Yeah, and those generational differences, as we said in the previous podcast about Jane Austen, are really worth noticing because things were changing incredibly fast in politics and also in the world generally between 1770 and 1800. Probably the most turbulent 30 years in European history, I suppose. I suppose we should add at this point that Byron wrote and published Don Juan serially, a bit like a Victorian novel before Victorian novels were published in that way, or indeed existed. And the first two cantos were published in 1819, and then the next three in 1821, and then cantos 6 to 16 followed in sort of batches in 1823, between 1823 and early 1824. And then you get a fragmentary 17th canto, which wasn't published until much later, which was found among Byron's papers after his death in April 1824.
Okay, may I now please return to my attempt at a plot synopsis?
Yes.
So, back in Seville, in Canto 1, Juan has his first romantic escapade at the age of 16 when he ends up in bed with a married 23-year-old called Donna Julia. And in the very... Julia.
I think Julia.
I think we'll go for Julia.
Yeah.
In the very public scandal that ensues, Donna Inez, who is Juan's moralistic mum, sends him away on a sort of punishment grand tour of Europe in the hope that he will get better manners.
And we ought to note that Donna Inez was immediately recognisable to just about the entire Western world as a vicious caricature of Byron's ex-wife, Lady Byron, née Annabella Milbank. And I would say that the act of making his hero's mother into a portrait of his own wife probably indicates something of the extent of Byron's mummy issues and his problems with women, perhaps generally.
Yeah. And the world could recognise Lady Byron as Donna Inez because when she left Byron in January 1816, after just 1 year of marriage, taking their infant daughter with her.
Who became Ada Lovelace, who incidentally wrote the first computer program, or was believed to have done so. And her mathematical skills, I think, didn't come from Byron, did they? Because her mother was a good mathematician.
Yeah. So Lady Byron takes Ada with her, and it was a huge public scandal, and the gossip columns went wild. Byron and his broken marriage were hot tabloid material.
Indeed.
Okay, we'll come back to that sort of sordid tale in a bit, but for now, let's get back to Donna Inez and Juan. So she packs him off to the high seas.
And that's immediately a disaster because Juan's ship is wrecked and the starving sailors resort first to eating his pet spaniel and then his faithful tutor Pedrillo, but Pedrillo, as Byron would have said. And as a dog lover, that seems to me to be entirely the wrong way around. You eat the tutor first, don't you, Claire?
You do eat the tutor first, I fully agree, yeah. Part was divided, part thrown in the sea, and such things as the entrails and the brains regaled 2 sharks who followed o'er the billow. The sailors ate the rest of poor Pedrillo.
I think poor spaniel, actually.
Fine, but after the cannibalism and the waves, Juan is the sole survivor, and he finds himself washed up on an idyllic Greek island, where he is taken care of by a beautiful girl named Heidi.
Her brow was overhung with coins of gold that sparkled o'er the auburn of her hair.
Yeah, beautiful Heidi. So Juan and Heidi fall in love and have many expensive parties celebrating their union.
Parties, you could call it that,
I mean, they do have a lot of parties.
Yeah.
Then Heidi's buzz-killing pirate father, Lambro, whom everyone had generally thought was dead, appears, seizes Juan and has him put aboard a slave ship bound for Constantinople.
Where, at the local slave market, he is duly purchased by a eunuch from the Turkish court who dresses him as a woman.
A la Hercules.
And forces him to join the Sultan's harem. Gulbez, the Sultana, falls in love with the cross-dressed Juana, but Juan rejects her and instead ends up in bed with Dudu, another harem girl. And she prompts, I think, one of Byron's most gorgeous couplets, which compares Dudu to Pygmalion's statue, the mortal and the marble still at strife and timidly expanding into life.
Yeah, that is truly, truly gorgeous. Yeah.
Anyway, the suspicion that something has gone on between Juan and Dudu sends Gulbeyaz into a rage, and she threatens to drown both of them in sacks. And Canto 6 ends on a cliffhanger as to whether in fact they will be drowned or whether they'll manage to escape.
Okay,
Ta-da!
We are almost halfway through the poem, I swear. So if you look back to Canto 1 briefly, you'll recall that Byron lists their various things to come in the course of the story, which were a riff on the ingredients of Homeric epic. So love and war, a heavy gale at sea, a list of ships and captains and kings reigning. So basically, now, after Constantinople, what happens is that we get the war. Juan gets a good old-fashioned dose of warfare.
And pretty much by accident, Juan finds himself fighting on the Russian side at the Siege of Ismail, which was an extremely bloody assault by the Russians on the Ottoman fortress of Ismail on the Black Sea in 1790. So topical events are being worked in.
Yeah. And here we get various grim reflections on the horror of war, plus some very unquotably unpleasant jokes about middle-aged Turkish women. And it's also where you come to realise quite how deep Byron's dedication to facts runs in the poem. You know, this isn't some generalised, romanticised depiction of battle. It's an accurate, literally blow-by-blow account of the siege and its key players and the exact kinds of fortifications and weapons that were used.
And we'll come back to Byron's love of facts because it's a crucial part of the poem. But so carry on. After the siege, and I think that's the worst bit of the poem, actually. It's the bit to skip if you haven't read the poem before, because it's where Byron is trying to rewrite Tasso's Jerusalem Liberata, and it really isn't his thing. But what happens next?
Pass over that. Well, so Juan, because he's acquitted himself so bravely on the Russian side, gets whisked off to St. Petersburg and the imperial court of Catherine the Great, whom Byron calls somewhat large, exuberant and truculent. And you can guess what word truculent rhymes with.
I can't possibly imagine. Could it be succulent?
It is succulent.
It could be
is
succulent. Yeah.
and she lusts after Juan with his dashing soldierly charms and his scarlet coat, and she makes him one of her favourites.
And he has a lovely time at the Russian court, being dissipated and badly behaved until suddenly he gets ill, probably from all that dissipation, which will do that to a boy, but possibly from the cold and his tiring time in the siege. So Catherine sends him to England as her emissary, where he will recuperate and also be pitched into the middle of London high society. Cue satire on London.
And this brings us to what are known as the English cantos, which form the last and, I think, best section of the poem.
Yeah.
And I think one reason they are so good is that they rerun in this slightly surreal, displaced way Byron's own Years of Fame, capital Y, capital F, which is the period that he spent as the toast of London society in the early 1810s, being courted by various flirtatious aristocratic Whig females. So Juan is presented at court, meets the Prince Regent, has dalliances, and ends up at a grand country house called Norman Abbey, the guest of Lady Adeline Amundeville and her politician husband, Lord Henry Amundeville.
So you get the world, Amund, the flesh and the Deville, I suppose, at that point of the poem. And here he experienced the full hellish nature of English country life, the fox hunting, the tea, the dinners, the profound boredom of it all. But he also catches the eye of three very different women: the icy Lady Adeline, who is his married host, the mysterious Aurora Raby, a teenage orphan, and the sexually rapacious Duchess of Fitzfulk.
Fitzfulk, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right at the end of the poem in Canto 16, where we're still in Norman Abbey, Juan has an encounter with a ghost, which when he reaches out and touches it, turns out not to be a ghost after all. Back fell the sable frock and dreary cowl, and they revealed, alas that ere they should, in full, voluptuous, but not o'ergrown bulk, the phantom of her frolic grace, Fitzfulk.
Love her frolic grace. So you get a nice bit of pantomimic Gothic entertainment to finish the story off, as though, I suppose, Byron's sort of having a go at rewriting Northanger Abbey, although finish, a more voluptuous version of it, obviously, but finish isn't perhaps quite the right word, because the poem, as we have it, just breaks off there, doesn't it, mid-narrative. And Byron wrote a few stanzas of a fragmentary 17th canto in early 1824 before he died, fighting for the Greeks in their war of independence against the Turks. And if he'd lived, who knows how long Don Juan might have been.
Might have been a two-podcaster.
It might have been.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this extract from On Satire, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.